You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow. You open the laptop, then close it. You scroll. You reorganize. You wait for the right mood. And somewhere in the background, a quiet accusation forms. Maybe I'm just lazy. But what if that's not true? What if you're not avoiding the work, but something else entirely? And what if the real pressure isn't visible at all? Visual, slow-moving light patterns. It doesn't feel dramatic. It's subtle. You wake up with a plan. You genuinely want to move forward. But when it's time to act, something inside you tightens. A slight heaviness in your chest. A restless urge to check your phone. A sudden need to make coffee first. You delay, not because you don't care, but because starting feels loaded. Visual, person sitting at desk staring at laptop. This pattern begins shaping your identity. You start calling yourself inconsistent, undisciplined, unfocused, and every unfinished task becomes evidence in a silent trial against yourself. But here's the strange part. When deadlines are urgent, when the pressure is external, you often perform well. You can focus, you can execute. So if you were truly lazy, that wouldn't happen. Which means something else is driving this. And that something is quieter. Visual, empty room with sunlight. Invisible pressure doesn't shout. It whispers. It says, if you do this, it has to be impressive. If you try, you can't fail. If you start, you have to prove something. The task becomes more than a task. It becomes a test of your identity. And your brain treats identity threats very seriously. You are not broken. You are not defective. You are responding exactly how a human nervous system is designed to respond to perceived pressure. Avoidance is not laziness. It's protection. When something feels like it could expose you, your intelligence, your competence, your worth, your brain activates caution. Not because it wants you to fail, but because it wants to prevent emotional pain. Visual abstract brain animation? And here's where it gets interesting. The brain doesn't just react to physical danger. It reacts to psychological threat. If starting a project feels like it might confirm your worst fear, I'm not good enough, your brain flags it. Even if that fear is irrational. Even if no one else is judging you. To your nervous system, the risk feels real. And so it pulls you toward safer behaviors. Scrolling, cleaning, planning without executing. These behaviors reduce anxiety in the short term, which teaches your brain something powerful. Avoidance equals relief. Relief equals reward. That's behavioral conditioning, and it's incredibly effective. Visual waves moving slowly, but it creates a loop. Pressure triggers anxiety. Anxiety triggers avoidance. Avoidance reduces anxiety. Reduction reinforces avoidance. Over time, the loop becomes automatic, not because you lack willpower, but because your brain is efficient. It repeats what reduces discomfort. Now let's go deeper. There's a concept in cognitive science called self-threat. When your performance becomes tied to your identity, effort feels dangerous. If you don't try, failure says nothing about you. But if you try and fail, it feels personal. So your brain makes a trade. Short-term guilt is safer than long-term shame. That's the invisible pressure. And it often comes from high internal standards. Perfectionism. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of disappointing yourself. You don't avoid because you don't care. You avoid because you care too much. Visual person walking alone at night. But here's the question that changes everything. How do you act when pressure feels internal and undefined? You can't fight something you can't see. So first, you make it visible. When you feel the urge to delay, pause. Not to force yourself, but to ask one question. What am I afraid this task will say about me? Write the answer down. Visual notebook with one sentence written. This works because labeling a fear activates the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning part of your brain, and reduces amygdala reactivity. Instead of vague anxiety, you get specific language. I'm afraid I won't do it perfectly. I'm afraid people will judge it. I'm afraid it won't match my potential. Now the pressure has a shape, and once it has a shape, it loses some of its power. But that's only step one. Step two is shrinking the identity risk. Instead of telling yourself, this has to be good, tell yourself, this is data. Your brain fears evaluation, but it tolerates experimentation. When you frame action as gathering information rather than proving worth, you reduce self-threat. That's cognitive reframing grounded in performance psychology. For example, instead of, I need to write a great chapter, try, I'm drafting 300 imperfect words to see what happens. The brain perceives lower stakes. Lower stakes reduce avoidance. You begin. Step 3 is something most people skip. Lower the emotional intensity before you start. Take 60 seconds of slow breathing. Long exhale. Why? Because extended exhales stimulate the vagus nerve, which signals safety to your nervous system. A calmer body sends a calmer message to the brain, and a calmer brain evaluates risk more realistically. Then, and this part matters, define a stopping point. Not a completion point, a stopping point. I will work for 10 minutes. Why does this work? Because the brain resists open-ended effort. It prefers boundaries. When effort feels infinite, avoidance increases. When effort feels contained, initiation becomes easier. And often once you begin, momentum carries you further. But the key is starting small enough that your brain doesn't panic. Step 4 is reinforcing identity in a different way. After you complete even a small action, acknowledge it. Not with hype, just accuracy. I acted despite discomfort. This builds what psychologists call self-efficacy. Belief in your ability to handle challenge. Self-efficacy reduces avoidance over time because the brain updates its prediction. It learns, discomfort doesn't destroy me. And prediction drives behavior. Visual abstract brain animation. Gradually the invisible pressure shifts. It doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling you. Because now instead of trying to eliminate fear, you've changed your relationship to it. Here's a mental model to carry forward. Imagine your mind as a smoke detector. It's designed to detect danger, but sometimes it reacts to steam, not fire. Invisible pressure is steam. Your brain treats it like flames. Avoidance is pulling the battery out. Temporary silence, but long-term damage. Instead, you recalibrate the detector. You check the room. You breathe. You verify. Is this actually dangerous or just uncomfortable? That distinction changes everything. Visual empty room with sunlight. You were never lazy. Lazy implies lack of care, but you care deeply. So deeply that your brain tried to shield you from potential shame. That protection simply became outdated. Now you're updating it. One small action at a time. One visible fear at a time. Visual waves moving slowly. And maybe the real shift isn't becoming more disciplined. Maybe it's becoming less threatened. Because when the invisible pressure becomes visible, it stops controlling you from the shadows. And the next time you hesitate, instead of asking, why am I so lazy? You might ask, what am I protecting? And that question is the beginning of momentum.